everyone, today we're going to talk about the age of Renaissance. I hope you guys enjoy and have fun.
The decline of the Church. The papacy of the Roman Catholic Church reached the height of its power in the 13th century, but papal claims of the temporal supremacy were increasingly out of step with the growing secular monarchies of Europe and a conflict with the territorial states that it was unable to win. First, Boniface VIII and the conflict with the states. The struggle between the papacy and the monarchies began during the pontificate of Pope Boniface VIII. One major issue appeared to be at stake between the Pope and the King Philip IV of France. Philip claimed the right to tax the French clergy, but Boniface VIII responded that the clergy of any state could not pay tax to their secular ruler without the Pope's consent. In short, the fundamental issue was the universal sovereignty of the papacy versus the royal sovereignty of the monarch. By excommunicating Philip IV, the latter sent a small contingent of French forces to capture Boniface and bring him back to the France for trial. The shock of this experience, however, soon led to the Pope's death. Philip's strong arms tactic had produced a clear victory for the national monarchy over the papacy, and no later Pope has dared renew the extravagant claims of Boniface VIII.
So the second part of the decline of church was about the papacy at Avignon that happens in 1305 until 1377. The residency of the popes in Avignon for most of the 14th century led to a decline in papal prestige and growing anti-papal sentiment. In the 1330s, the popes began to construct a stately palace in Avignon, a clear indication that they intended to stay for some time. The decline in papal prestige during the Avignonese residency, also caused by the popes at Avignon, were captives of the French monarchy. The papal residency at Avignon brought an important changing of economic and political conditions of Europe. Like the growing monarchical states, the popes centralized their administration by developing a specialized bureaucracy and became the most sophisticated administrative system in the medieval world. Avignon had become a powerful symbol of abuses within the church, and many people began to call for the pope's return to Rome. One of the most prominent calls came from Catherine of Siena, whose saintly demeanor and claims of visions from God led the city of Florence to send her on a mission to Pope Gregory IX in Avignon. And then the second part of the decline of the church was about the Great Schism. Catherine of Siena's admonition heeded in 1377, when at long last Pope Gregory IX, perceiving the disastrous decline in papal prestige, returned to Rome. Soon afterward, he died in the spring of 1378, when the College of Cardinals met in conclave to elect a new pope. The citizens of Rome, fearful that the French majority would choose another Frenchman who would return the papacy to Avignon. Indeed, the guards of the conclave warned the cardinals that they ran the risk of being torn in pieces if they didn't choose an Italian. Wisely, the terrified cardinals duly elected the Italian Archbishop of Bari, who was subsequently crowned as Pope Urban VI on Easter Sunday. Since Urban remained in Rome, there were no two popes, initiating what has been called the Great Schism of the Church. The Great Schism lasted for nearly 40 years and had a baleful effect on the Catholic Church and Christendom in general. The schism greatly aggravated the financial abuses that had developed within the Church during the Avignon's papacy. At the same time, the schism badly damaged the faith of Christian believers.
New thoughts on church and state and the rise of conciliarism. As dissatisfaction with the papacy grew, so did the calls for a revolutionary approach to solving the church's institutional problems. One of the most systematic was provided by Marsigillo of Padua, rector of University of Paris and author of remarkable book Defender of the Peace. Marsigillo argued the church is a community of the faithful in which all authority is ultimately derived from the entire community. The clergy hold no special authority from God, but serve only to administer the affairs of the church on behalf of all Christians. The Conciliar movement. The criticisms led large number of churchmen to take up this theory, known as conciliarism, in the belief of that only a general council of the church could end the schism and bring reform to the church in its head and members. The need for political support caused both popes to subordinate their policies to the policies of this stage. Finally, reconciliation was held and appointed Pope Martin V. The Great Schism has finally been ended. Popular religion in an age of adversity. In the 14th century, the Black Death and its recurrency made an important impact on the religious life of ordinary Christians by heightening their preoccupation with death and salvation. Christians responded in different ways to the adversities of the 14th century. First, there was a tendency to stress the performance of good works, including acts of charity as a means of ensuring salvation. Then purgatory was defined by the Church as the place where souls went after death to be purged of punishment for sins committed in life. In effect, the soul was purified in purgatory before it ascended into heaven. All of these developments were part of a larger trend, a new emphasis in late medieval Christianity of a mechanical path to salvation. This is particularly evident in the popularity of mysticism and lay piety in the 14th century. Mysticism is the immediate experience of oneness with God. It's this experience that characterized the teaching of Meister Eckhart. Eckhart's movement spread from Germany into the Low Countries, where it took on a new form, called the modern devotion, founded by Gerhard Grut. To achieve true spiritual communication with God, people must imitate Jesus and lead lives dedicated to serving the needs of their fellow human beings. Second, unique female mystical experience. A number of female mystics have their own unique spiritual experience. For them, fasting and receiving the Eucharist, the communication wafer that, according to Roman Catholic doctrines, contains the body of Jesus, become the mainstay of the religious practices. Catherine of Siena, for example, gave up eating any solid food at the age of 23 and thereafter lived only on cold water and herbs that she sucked and then spat out. For Catherine and a number of other female mystics, reception of the Eucharist were their primary instrument in achieving of mystical union with God.
Okay, so next up we have the cultural world of the 14th century, the development of the vernacular literature. First one we have Dante Alighieri. He came from an old Florentine noble family that had fallen on hard times. Dante's masterpiece in the Italian vernacular was The Divine Comedy, written between 1313 and 1321. The Divine Comedy is basically the story of the soul's progression to salvation, a fundamental medieval preoccupation. The lengthy poem was divided into three major sections corresponding to the realms of the afterworld: hell, purgatory, and heaven or paradise. Next, here we have Francesco Petrarca, known as Petrarch, was a Florentine who spent much of his life outside his native city. His primary contribution to the development of the Italian vernacular was made in his sonnets. He is considered one of the greatest European lyric poets. His sonnets were inspired by his love for a married lady named Laura, whom he had met in 1327. After Petrarch, we have Boccaccio. He wrote poetry. His name is Giovanni Boccaccio. He is known primarily for his prose. His best known work is the Decameron. However, it was not written until after he had returned to Florence. The Decameron is set at the time of the Black Death. It reflects the immediate easygoing, cynical, post-Black values. Next, we have Geoffrey Chaucer, who brought a new level of sophistication to the English vernacular language in his famous Canterbury Tales. These tales is a collection of stories told by a group of 29 pilgrims journeying from the London suburb of Southwark to the tomb of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury. And now we're talking about Christina de Pihan. Her poems were soon in demand, and by 104,000 she had achieved financial security. The Book of the City of Ladies, written in 1404, she denounced that many male writers who had argued that women needed to be controlled by men because women by their very nature were prone to evil, unable to learn, and easily swayed. Next, we have a new art, Giotto. The city of Florence witnessed the first dramatic break with medieval tradition in the work of Giotto, often considered a forerunner of Italian Renaissance painting. Giotto's figures were solid and rounded, placed realistically in relationship to each other and their background. They conveyed three-dimensional depth.
Society in an age of adversity. New inventions were made at 14th century, but at the same time, the effects of the plague were felt in many areas of medieval urban life. The first one is changes in urban life. Immediate byproduct of the Black Death was better regulation of urban activities by town governments. Authorities tried to keep cities cleaner by enacting new ordinances against waste products in the streets. Medieval society had tolerated prostitution as a lesser evil. The demand for prostitutes was high and was made by regular supply. The recession of 14th century increased the supply of prostitutes, while the new hedonism prevalent after the Black Death also increased demand. By organizing brothels, city authorities would supervise as well as tax prostitutes. So next one is family life and gender roles in late medieval cities. The basic unit of the late medieval town was the nuclear family of husband, wife, and children. Before the Black Death, late marriages were common, but it changed after the plague. The economic difficulties of the 14th century also tended to strengthen the development of gender roles. Ideas about the different natures of men and women became widely accepted. Men were domineering and women were submissive. However, some women benefited from the effects of the Black Death. The deaths of male workers opened up new jobs for women. And the next one is medieval children. Parents in the high and later middle ages invested considerable resources and affection in rearing their children. The growth of cities demanded a commitment to educating children for the new occupation. Some cities provided schools to educate the young. As a result of the plague, some communities invested in the survival and health of children. A number of hospitals were established, supporting them until boys could be taught a trade and girls could marry. The next one is new direction in medicine. The medical community comprised a number of functionaries. Top of medical hierarchy were the physicians, usually clergymen, who received their education in the universities. They were highly trained in theory but had little clinical practice. The pre-plague medicine of university-trained physicians was theoretically grounded in the classical Greek theory of four humors. Below the physicians stood the surgeons, whose activities included performing an operation. Below surgeons were midwives, who delivered babies, and barber surgeons, who were less trained than surgeons and performed menial tasks such as bloodletting. All these medical practitioners proved unable to deal with the plague. This failure produced a crisis that resulted in some new approaches to healthcare. One result was the rise of surgeons to greater prominence because of their practical knowledge, and cities, especially in Italy, gave increased attention to public health and sanitation.
Meaning and characteristics of the Italian Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth. Many people who lived in Italy between 1350 and 1550 believed that they had witnessed a rebirth of antiquity or Greco-Roman civilization, marking a new age. To them, the 1,000 or so years between the end of the Roman Empire and their own era constitute a middle period, or the Middle Age, characterized by darkness because of its lack of classical culture. Renaissance Italy was largely an urban society. Northern Italy became the centers of Italian political, economic, social, and cultural life. Within this new urban society, a secular spirit emerged. The Renaissance was an age of recovery from the calamitous 14th century, a time for the slow process of recuperating from the effects of the Black Death, political disorder, and economic recession. This recovery was accompanied by a rediscovery of the culture of classical antiquity, also a revived emphasis on individual ability or a high regard for human dignity and worth, and a realization of individual potentiality created a new social ideal of the well-rounded personality or universal person become a characteristic of the Italian Renaissance.
Making of Renaissance society. By the 14th century, Italian merchants were carrying on a flourishing commerce throughout the Mediterranean and had also expanded their lines of trade north along the Atlantic seaboard. A group of merchants in the north known as the Hanseatic language began to control most of the commercial trade around Europe. Expansion of trade. The Hanseatic language, sometimes called the Hansa, was simply a group of small coastal towns in Germany that grew to include over 80 cities in all and specialized in trade. The language had markets in many of the most prominent northern towns, such as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The language has established markets in Flanders as well. Flanders came to be known as the one place in which merchants of the Hansa and merchants of the Flanders fleet of Venice could meet and trade amongst themselves. In general, however, trade in the Renaissance dramatically increased from where it had been in the Middle Ages. The Italians, and more specifically the Venetians, profited greatly from this economic boost. That is until the discovery of the New World place a greater emphasis on trade with the Western cities. Trade in the Mediterranean became less profitable as trade across the Atlantic increased. Industries old and new. By the beginning of the 15th century, however, the Florentine woolen had begun to recover. The woolen industry of Florence was able to flourish as well as a number of different other Italian industries, including silk, glassware, and handmade metal and gemstone products. Other new industries, especially printing, mining, and metallurgy, began to rival the textile industry in the importance in the 15th century. Banking and the Medici. Soon after the Middle Ages, the economy of Florence improved due to the Medici family. The family had previously specialized in the production of cloth, but in the 14th expanded to commerce, real estate, banking, the production of wool, silk, and the mining of alum. The family soon came to hold great amounts of power, both in Florence and in the church. Socials in the Renaissance. The Renaissance inherited its social structure from the Middle Ages. Society remained fundamentally divided into three estates. 1. The nobility. By 1500, certain ideas came to be expected of the noble or aristocrat. These ideals were best expressed in the Book of the Courtier by the Italian Baldassare Castiglione, and remained a fundamental handbook for European aristocrats for centuries. Three of the most dominant attributes that he assigned to nobles were: a noble should possess certain qualities such as good character, grace, talents, and a noble birth. A noble should be learned and should practice certain physical and military exercises. A noble should have a classical education and should be able to play an instrument or be a proficient artist. 2. Peasants and townspeople. The majority of the European population in the Renaissance was, like at many other times in history, made of the common folk. They, however, had a slightly new place in society in the Renaissance because serfdom had just fallen out of regular practice. In fact, about 30 until 40% of all urban inhabitants were poor. However, they were not the lowest of the low. Below them still were the slaves. However, above them were the shopkeepers, guild members, and barkers. These people lived economically average lives and earned meager wages by providing goods for the general population. 3. Slavery in the Renaissance. Agricultural slavery existed in the early Middle Ages but had declined for economic reasons and been replaced by serfdom by the 9th century. Although some domestic slaves remained, slavery in European society had largely disappeared by the 11th century.
The Italian states in the Renaissance. The five major states. By the 15th century, five major powers dominated the Italian peninsula: Milan, Venice, Florence, the Papal States, and Naples. Northern Italy was divided between the Duchy of Milan and the Republic of Venice. At the end of the 14th century, Venice embarked on the conquest of a territorial state in the northern Italy to protect its food supply and its overland trade routes. Although expansion on the mainland made sense to the Venetian, it frightened Milan and Florence. Through lavish patronage and careful courting political allies, Cosimo (1434 until 1464) and later his grandson Lorenzo the Magnificent 1469 until 1492 were successful in dominating the city at a time when Florence was a center of the cultural Renaissance. The Renaissance popes of the 15th century directed much of their energy toward re-establishing their control over the Papal States. The Kingdom of Naples remained a backward monarchy with a population consisting largely of poverty-stricken peasants dominated by unruly nobles. Independent city-states. Beside the five major states, there were a number of independent city-states under the control of powerful ruling families that became brilliant centers of Renaissance culture in the 15th century. Federico da Montefeltro and his wife Battista Sforza ruled the small central Italian principality of Urbino. Under his direction, Urbino became a well-known cultural and intellectual center. A noticeable feature of the smaller Renaissance courts was the important role played by women. The most famous of the Renaissance ruling women was Isabella Este, 1474 until 1539. Their court was another important center of art and learning in the Renaissance. Warfare in Italy. The growth of the powerful monarchical states led to trouble for the Italians. Italian wealth and splendor would probably have been in fighting to its northern neighbors under any circumstance, but it was actually the breakdown of the Italian balance of power that encouraged the invention and began the Italian Wars. Feeling isolated, Ludovico Sforza, the Duke of Milan, foolishly invited the French to intervene in Italian politics. Although some Italians had differentiated between Italians and barbarians, all foreigners, few Italians convinced of creating an alliance and confederation of states that could repel foreign invaders. The birth of modern diplomacy. The modern diplomatic system was a product of the Italian Renaissance. There were ambassadors in the Middle Ages, but they were used only on a temporary basis. This concept of an ambassador changed during the Italian Renaissance because of the political situation in Italy. An ambassador was now an agent only of the territorial state that sent him, not the larger body of Christendom. Machiavelli and the new statecraft. No one gave better expression to the Renaissance preoccupation with political power than Niccolo Machiavelli, 1469 until 1527. The Prince Machiavelli's ideas on politics stem from two major sources: his knowledge of ancient Rome and his preoccupation with Italy's political problems. His major concern in The Prince were the acquisition and expansion of political power as the means to restore and maintain order in his time. Machiavelli found a good example of the new Italian ruler in Caesar Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, who used the ruthless measure to achieve his goal of carving out a new state in central Italy. The intellectual renaissance in Italy. Individualism and secularism, two characteristics of the Italian Renaissance, were most noticeable in the intellectual and artistic realms. Italian Renaissance humanism. Renaissance humanism was an intellectual movement based on the study of the classical literary works of Greece and Rome. The central importance of literary preoccupation in Renaissance humanism is evident in the professional status or occupation of the humanists. The emergence of humanism Petrarch 1304 until 1374 has often been called the father of Italian Renaissance humanism. Petrarch did more than any other individual in the 14th century to foster the development of Renaissance humanism.
Humanism in 15th century Italy. In Florence, the humanist movement took a new direction when it became closely tied to Florentine civic spirit and pride, giving rise to what one modern soul has labeled civic humanism. Civic humanism reflected the values of the urban society of the Italian Renaissance. Also evident in the humanism of the first half of the 15th century was a growing interest in classical Greek civilization. Humanism and philosophy. In the second half of the 15th century, a dramatic upsurge of interest in the works of Plato occurred, especially evident among the members of an informal discussion group known as the Florentine Platonic Academy. Renaissance Hermetism. Hermetism was another product of the Florentine intellectual environment of the late 15th century. At the request of Cosimo de' Medici, Ficino translated into Latin a Greek word titled Corpus Hermeticum. The Hermetic manuscripts contain two kinds of writing. For Renaissance intellectuals, the Hermetic revival offered a new view of humankind. They believed that human beings had been created as divine beings with divine creative power, but had freely chosen to enter the material world or nature. Education in the Renaissance. The humanist movement had a profound effect on education. Renaissance humanists believed that human beings could be dramatically changed by education. They wrote books on education and developed a secondary school based on their idea. Was there a Renaissance for women? Historians have disagreed over the benefits of the Renaissance for women. Other historians have argued that although conditions remained bleak for most women, some women, especially those in courtly, religious, and intellectual environments, found ways to develop a new sense of themselves as women. This may be especially true of women who were educated in the humanist fashion and went on to establish their own literary careers. First one, Isotta Nogarola, born to a noble family in Verona, mastered Latin and wrote numerous letters and treatises that brought her praise from male Italian intellectuals. Second one is Cassandra Feddo of Venice, who learned both Latin and Greek from humanist tutors hired by her family, became well known in Venice for her public recitation of oration. Third one, Laura Sereta, was educated in Latin by her father, a physician from Brescia. Laura defended the ability of women to pursue scholarly pursuits. Humanism and history. Influenced by Roman and Greek historians, the humanists approached the writing of history differently from the chronicles of the Middle Ages. The humanists believed that classical civilization had been followed by an age of barbarism, or the Middle Ages, which had in turn been succeeded by their own age, with its rebirth of the study of the classics enabled them to think in terms of the passage of time, of the past as past.
Here are the impact of printing. Please pause to read.
Art in the early Renaissance. Leonardo and other Italians maintained that it was Giotto in the 14th century who began the imitation of nature. But what Giotto had begun was not taken up until the work of Masaccio. Masaccio's cycle of frescoes in the Brancacci Chapel has long been regarded as the first masterpiece of early Renaissance art. During 15th century, the other Florentine painters absorbed and modified new Renaissance style. They developed an experimental trend that took two directions. One emphasized the mathematical side of painting, the working out of the laws of perspective, and the organization of outdoor space and light by geometry and perspective. During the last decades of the 15th century, a new sense of invention emerged in Florence. The realism that characterized the painting of the early Renaissance removed to an otherworldly quality. The revolutionary achievements were matched by equally stunning advances in sculpture and architecture. Donato di Donatello spent time in Rome studying and copying the statues of antiquity. Among his numerous works was a statue of David, which is the first known life-size, freestanding bronze nude in European art since antiquity. It was made to commemorate the victory of Florence over Milan in 1428. Filippo Brunelleschi, a friend of Donatello, accompanied the latter to Rome. He drew much inspiration from architectural monuments of Roman antiquity, and he poured his new insights into the creation of new architecture. His first project involved the challenge of building a dome for the unfinished cathedral in Florence, the Duomo. The artistic high Renaissance. By the end of 15th century, Italian painters, sculptors, and architects had created a new artistic environment. Many artists had mastered the new techniques. They moved into individualistic forms of creative expression. This final stages of Renaissance art is called the High Renaissance. It was marked by the increasing importance of Rome as the new cultural center of the Italian Renaissance. The High Renaissance was dominated by the work of three artistic giants, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Michelangelo. Leonardo represents a transitional figure in the shift to High Renaissance principle. His Last Supper, painted in Milan, is a brilliant summary of 15th century trends and its organization of space and use of perspective to depict subject three-dimensionally in a two-dimensional medium. The artist and social status. In the Middle Ages, artists were still largely viewed as artisans, since guilds depended on commissions for their projects. Patrons played an important role in the art of early Renaissance. The wealthy upper classes determined both content and the purpose of the paintings and sculptures.
The Artistic Renaissance. The Northern Artistic Renaissance. In Italy, the human form became the primary vehicle of expression as Italian artists sought to master technical skills that allowed them to portray humans in realistic settings. The most influential northern school of art in the 15th century was centered in Flanders. Jan van Eyck was among the first to use oil paint, a medium that enabled the artist to use a varied range of colors and create fine details. Northern painters placed a great emphasis of emotional intensity of religious feeling and created great works of devotional art, especially in their altarpieces. One northern artist of this later period who was greatly affected by the Italian was Albrecht Dürer from Nuremberg. Tried to achieve standard of ideal beauty and absorb of what Italians could teach, as is evident in his mastery of laws of perspective and Renaissance theories of proportion. Music in the Renaissance. In 15th century, an extraordinary cultural environment was fostered in the domains of the Dukes of Burgundy in Northern Europe. Duvet was the first to use secular tunes to replace Gregorian chants as the fixed melody that served as the basis for the Mass. In Italy and France, the chief form of secular music was the madrigal, the Renaissance madrigal. First, a poem set of music and was originated in 14th century Italian courts. Second, a 12-line poem written in the vernacular. Third, the theme was emotional or irregular. Fourth, by the mid-16th century, most of it were written for 5 or 6 voices and employed a technique called text painting. Fifth, by the mid-16th century, the madrigal also spread to England, where the most popular form was characterized by the fa-la-la refrain like that found in English carol Deck the Halls. So this is the end of the video. I hope everyone enjoy and have a great day. Bye bye.